There's a phenomenon that doesn't make sense. It shouldn't exist. And yet, thousands of people, ordinary people from different countries, different continents, different walks of life, describe the exact same terrifying encounter. They didn't know each other. They'd never met. Some of them don't even know these reports exist. Yet their stories are identical down to the smallest, most unsettling detail. They call them the black-eyed children. And if you're watching this at night, alone in your home, you might want to reconsider what I'm about to tell you, because this isn't just a story. These are accounts from real people, people who experienced something that conventional science can't explain, people who saw something that looked almost human but wasn't. Welcome back to this channel. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most disturbing phenomena in modern paranormal history. By the time this video ends, you'll understand why thousands of people across the globe are reporting the same inexplicable encounter, and you'll understand why even in broad daylight the thought of these children is enough to make people lock their doors and check their windows. Let's begin. The first documented report came in 1996. A man named Brian Bethel, a journalist and writer, was sitting in his car in a parking lot when something happened that would change his life forever and spark a wave of similar reports across the entire world. He was alone, doors locked, engine running. It was late at night. Then came a knock on his window. When he looked, there were children standing outside. They looked normal at first glance, but something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Their eyes were completely black, not dark, not shadowed, completely, impossibly black, like someone had removed the whites of their eyes entirely and replaced them with pure darkness. No iris, no pupil, just black. They asked him for a ride. They spoke in calm, emotionless voices. They said they needed to go home. And in that moment, Brian Bethel felt something he'd never felt before, pure, primal fear, an instinct that screamed at him, "Do not let these things in your car." He refused. The children became insistent. They told him he had to let them in. Their voices remained unnaturally calm, but there was an underlying compulsion in their words, almost like a command disguised as a request. When he refused again, they simply walked away, and Brian Bethel sat there shaking, unable to explain what he just witnessed. He went home and wrote down everything that happened. That account was posted on the internet, and that's when something extraordinary occurred. Other people started coming forward, people from completely different parts of the world, people who had never heard of Brian Bethel's encounter, people who had no reason to fabricate the same story, and they all described the same phenomenon with remarkable consistency. A woman in England reported children with completely black eyes knocking on her door at midnight. A man in Australia said he encountered them outside his home. A teenager in Canada described seeing them at a bus stop. Each account was slightly different in setting, but the core elements were identical. Children with entirely black eyes, unnaturally calm voices, a request or demand for entry or assistance, and an overwhelming sense of wrongness and dread. By the early 2000s, the reports had multiplied into hundreds, then thousands. Online forums dedicated to the phenomenon sprung up. Paranormal investigators began collecting testimonies, and yet there was no logical explanation. No disease caused completely black eyes. No psychological disorder created this exact symptom across thousands of unrelated people, and no hoax could maintain this level of consistency across so many independent reports. The phenomenon became known as the black-eyed children, and it remains one of the most perplexing and terrifying mysteries in paranormal history. Let me share some of the most compelling accounts with you. These are from people willing to go on record, people with nothing to gain from lying. In 2002, a woman named Sarah M. reported an encounter that happened outside her suburban home in Texas. She was putting groceries in her car when she noticed two children standing on the curb across the street. They were a boy and a girl, both appearing to be around 10 or 11 years old. They wore normal clothing, a hoodie and jeans. They could have been any neighborhood children, but their eyes stopped her cold. She described them as the darkest black I've ever seen, like looking into a void, like the eyes of something that isn't human pretending to be human. While she stood frozen watching them, they turned and walked directly toward her. Their movements were odd, too precise, too synchronized, like they were being controlled by the same puppet master. They asked her if she wanted to come play. Their voices were flat, emotionless, devoid of any childlike warmth. When she didn't respond, they came closer. She said she felt a compulsion building in her mind, not a voice, but an overwhelming urge to say yes, to invite them somewhere, to do what they wanted. Terrified, she got in her car and locked the doors. The children stood outside the window, staring at her with those impossible black eyes, their faces completely blank. She started the engine and drove away. When she looked in her rearview mirror, they were still standing in the street, perfectly still, watching her leave. She went to the police. The police found nothing. No children matching that description lived in her neighborhood. No reports of strange children from anyone else. It was as if they'd vanished completely. In 2005, a man named David K. from Colorado reported a deeply disturbing encounter with the black-eyed children. He was home alone on a Friday night when someone knocked on his front door. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he looked through the peephole. Standing on his porch were 3 children. They looked to be between 8 and 13 years old. They wore normal clothing, but something about them was fundamentally wrong. Their faces were too still, their breathing didn't seem to move their chests, and their eyes. He described opening the door slightly, just enough to talk to them. They asked him if they could come inside. They said they needed to use his phone. He told them no, they couldn't come in. That's when something shifted. One of the children, a girl with long dark hair and those terrible black eyes, placed her hand on the door frame and looked directly at his face. She didn't speak, but in that moment he felt it, a pressure in his mind, a compulsion that was almost irresistible, an overwhelming primal command. Let us in, he said. It felt like his mind was being overwritten, like his own free will was being forcibly extracted from him. He was actually reaching for the doorknob when he suddenly snapped out of it, almost like waking from a dream. The effort required to resist felt inhuman, like he was fighting against something far more powerful than 3 children. He slammed the door and locked it. He could hear them standing on the porch for several minutes, completely silent. Then they left. He never saw them again. What terrified him most wasn't the encounter itself. It was realizing that he almost opened that door, that something had nearly overridden his own consciousness. In 2008, a family in Minnesota reported a series of encounters with the black-eyed children that lasted several weeks. It started with a single child knocking on their back door in the middle of the night. A boy, maybe 12 years old, with completely black eyes. The mother who answered the door asked what he wanted. He said he needed to come inside. She refused and closed the door. Over the next 3 weeks, he or others like him returned. Different times, different doors, but always the same request. Always the same overwhelming sense of dread and compulsion. The family began documenting everything. They set up cameras. They called the police repeatedly. The police found nothing. No children in the neighborhood matched the description. No evidence that anyone had been at their doors. But the family knew they hadn't imagined it. They all saw the same thing. They all felt the same terrifying compulsion. And they all knew that whatever was knocking on their doors was not human. After 3 weeks, the knocking stopped. The family moved out within a month. In 2011, a truck driver named Marcus reported an encounter that happened on a deserted stretch of highway in Wyoming. He was driving late at night when he saw 2 children standing on the side of the road, seemingly trying to hitchhike. It was unusual, no houses for miles, no indication of civilization, but he was tired and 2 children wouldn't be a threat. He pulled over. As they approached the truck, he saw their eyes, completely black. He immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. He told them to get away from his truck. They came to the passenger window and began pleading with him to open the door, to let them inside. Their voices were calm, but underneath was a note of something else, something ancient, something that didn't belong in a child's voice. He refused and drove away, but in his side mirror he watched as they stood in the road, perfectly still, their black eyes following him as he accelerated. And the most disturbing part, they didn't look concerned or confused. They looked expectant, like they knew exactly what he would do, like they had already accounted for every choice he might make. In 2014, a woman named Jennifer M. from California reported something that deviated slightly from the standard account, but added a deeply unsettling dimension. She encountered the black-eyed children in broad daylight at a grocery store. She saw them in an aisle, 2 children with completely black eyes, dressed in clothes that seemed slightly off, slightly anachronistic. But here's what made her account different. She recognized one of them, or rather she recognized the face. It was her daughter, or a version of her daughter, an impossible replica that looked exactly like her child but with completely black eyes, standing beside her in the grocery store, staring at her, not blinking, not moving, just present. She grabbed her actual daughter's hand and left immediately. When she turned back to look, the black-eyed child version of her daughter was still standing exactly where it had been, watching her leave. Her real daughter had seen it too. She was traumatized for weeks. This account, along with others like it, has led some researchers to propose an absolutely terrifying theory, that the black-eyed children can replicate people, that they can create copies, and that some of them may already be living among us. When you examine hundreds of accounts across decades, patterns begin to emerge, and these patterns are deeply unsettling because they suggest something deliberate, something intelligent, something with a goal. In nearly every account, the black-eyed children make a request. They ask for entry into homes. They ask for rides. They ask for permission. And this is crucial. They always ask. They never force entry. It's as if they need consent. Consent for what exactly is unknown. But the consistency of this pattern across thousands of independent reports suggests it's not random, it's not accidental, it's intentional. This has led paranormal researchers to propose a terrifying hypothesis. What if the black-eyed children operate under some kind of rule? What if they cannot enter a space without permission? What if they cannot touch a human without consent? And what if their entire purpose is to obtain that consent? If this theory is correct, then every encounter is an attempt to break through a barrier, to circumvent a protection, to gain access to something they shouldn't have access to. Nearly every witness reports feeling an overwhelming compulsion when in the presence of the black-eyed children, a pressure in the mind, an urge to comply, an instinct to say yes. And what's remarkable is that this compulsion seems to work on the subconscious level. Witnesses describe almost losing control of their actions, of reaching for doorknobs they didn't consciously decide to open, of almost inviting entities into their homes before snapping back to awareness. This suggests the black-eyed children possess some kind of psychic ability, some form of mental influence that operates on a level deeper than conscious thought, which raises an absolutely chilling question. How many people didn't snap out of it in time? How many people opened those doors? The most consistent element across every single account is the eyes, completely black, no white, no color, no humanity, just pure absolute blackness. And every witness describes the same sensation when making eye contact, a feeling of staring into an abyss, a feeling of looking at something that isn't human pretending to be human. One researcher, paranormal investigator Jason Offutt, proposed that the eyes might be a biological adaptation, that these creatures might come from an environment where human eyes, with their whites and pupils, are abnormal, where completely black eyes are the evolutionary standard, which would suggest they're not human, they're not a disease or a psychological phenomenon. They're something else, something from somewhere else. The vast majority of encounters happen at night, between the hours of 8 p.m. and 4 a.m., and within that window, there are peaks around midnight and 3 a.m. Why? Is there something about nighttime that weakens the barrier between worlds? Is there something about sleep, that liminal state between consciousness and unconsciousness, that makes humans vulnerable? Or is the black-eyed children's activity simply invisible during daylight because they can blend in more easily? While reports have come from around the globe, there are certain hotspots. Texas is one, the Pacific Northwest, parts of England, Australia. These areas have unusually high concentrations of reports, which suggests either that the black-eyed children are concentrated in these areas or that something about these locations makes contact with them more likely. Some researchers have theorized that these locations might have thin places, areas where the barrier between dimensions is weaker. Ancient indigenous peoples believe certain locations had thinner veils between worlds. Could these be the same places? Every single witness reports the same emotional response: absolute primal terror. Not fear of the unknown, not the discomfort of encountering something unusual, but deep cellular terror, the kind of fear your body produces when it recognizes an apex predator or an incomprehensible threat. Psychologist Dr. James Horan has studied hundreds of these accounts and noted something remarkable. The consistency of the fear response suggests a real encounter with something that genuinely threatens human safety. Because if these were hallucinations or psychological episodes, the fear response would vary, but it doesn't. It's nearly identical across the board. The black-eyed children demonstrate remarkable intelligence and adaptability. They learn, they adjust their tactics. Early encounters involve straightforward requests. Modern encounters are more sophisticated. Some reports describe them attempting to use social engineering, claiming they're lost children, claiming they need help, using psychological manipulation to lower people's defenses. They seem to understand human psychology. They seem to understand how to trigger compliance. They seem to understand boundaries and permissions, which suggests they're not mindless creatures. They're intelligent, purposeful, and possibly studying us. After examining decades of accounts, after analyzing the patterns, after considering the theories, we're left with questions that have no answers. And that's what makes the black-eyed children phenomenon so unsettling. Not what we know, but what we don't know, and what we might never know. Where do they come from? What are their origins? Are they natural inhabitants of another dimension? Are they artificial creations? Are they something else entirely that our language doesn't have words for? What do they want? Why do they need consent? What are they trying to gain from entry into our homes and vehicles? Is it physical access, psychic access, genetic material, knowledge? Are they trying to study us, use us, change us? How many people have said yes? How many people have opened their doors to the black-eyed children? And what happened to them? Why don't we hear from those people? Are they still out there? Are they still themselves? Why are the reports increasing? Modern accounts are far more frequent than accounts from decades past. Is the phenomenon accelerating? Are more of them manifesting in our reality? Or are more people willing to report genuine encounters now? What are they doing when no one's watching, when they're not requesting entry, not asking for consent, not performing the rituals they perform in front of humans? What is their actual purpose? What are they actually doing in our world? And most importantly, will they stop? Or does each encounter represent a step in a larger plan, a progression towards something we can't see coming, a slow, deliberate infiltration of our reality by something fundamentally other? This is where the paranormal researchers step in. This is where we begin to explore the possibilities. This is where theory becomes investigation. This is the most commonly proposed explanation. The theory suggests that the black-eyed children are beings from another dimension, a parallel reality, that intersects with ours at specific locations and times. They're not aliens in the traditional sense. They're not ghosts or demons. They're something else entirely. Beings that have learned to navigate the space between dimensions. Their complete black eyes might be the result of existing partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The blackness could be the absence of light reflection, the visual signature of something that doesn't fully exist in our three-dimensional space. If this theory is correct, then their attempts to gain entry into our homes and vehicles might be attempts to establish a stronger foothold in our dimension. Consent might be a necessary element because without it, they cannot fully materialize or interact with our reality, which means every person who refuses them is protecting not just themselves, but possibly everyone around them. Some paranormal researchers have proposed a deeply disturbing alternative, that the black-eyed children are parasitic entities, not interested in harming us in the traditional sense, but in feeding off us, in using us. The compulsion they generate could be a feeding mechanism. The more someone resists them, the more psychic energy is expended, and psychic energy might be what they consume, which would explain why they always seem satisfied after an encounter, whether successful or not. They fed either way. And the request for consent might be a necessity because humans have some kind of psychic immunity that only consent can bypass. Without permission, they can't drain us effectively. With it, they can potentially harvest years' worth of psychic energy, or implant something, or change something fundamental about a person's consciousness. This theory suggests that everyone who's encountered the black-eyed children is potentially compromised, potentially marked, and that the phenomenon might be spreading through a kind of psychic contagion, each encounter creating more hosts for future encounters. Some religious paranormal researchers have proposed that the black-eyed children are demonic entities, not demons in the classical sense, but manifestations of negative spiritual energy or demonic consciousness taking on a physical form. Their complete black eyes could represent the absence of the human soul, the void where a spirit should exist. Their compulsive effect could be demonic influence. Their intelligence could be the cunning of ancient evil, and their obsession with obtaining consent could be rooted in the theological principle that spiritual forces require permission to directly influence humans. If this theory is correct, then refusing them is a form of spiritual protection, and every person who resists them is engaged in a battle between light and darkness, which would explain the visceral, primal nature of the fear response. On some deep level, humans recognize demonic presence as a threat to their soul. A more mundane but equally disturbing theory proposes that the black-eyed children are the result of human experimentation, either secret government programs or private organizations conducting genetic engineering on abducted children. The completely black eyes could be a genetic modification designed to create improved night vision. The compulsive ability could be the result of psychic enhancement experiments. The intelligence and adaptability could indicate successful cognitive augmentation, and the request for permission could be programming parameters built into their neural architecture by scientists. This theory would explain the intelligence, the learning capacity, and the evolving tactics. But it raises an even more terrifying question. If someone is creating these beings, what is their endgame? Are they building an army, testing weapons, preparing for something catastrophic? Some researchers have proposed that the black-eyed children might not be supernatural at all. They might be human, or rather they might be what humans are evolving into. The theory suggests that humanity is undergoing a metamorphosis, that in certain bloodlines or genetic lineages, evolution is accelerating, that the completely black eyes are an adaptation to modern life, perhaps increased melatonin production in response to electronic light exposure, or a biological adaptation to environmental toxins. If this is true, then the black-eyed children are our future. They're what we're becoming, and their attempts to establish consent and enter our spaces might be attempts at integration, to prepare society for a future where these beings walk among us openly. But this theory has a dark undercurrent. If this is evolution, and if these beings eventually outnumber baseline humans, what happens to our species? Are we being bred out? Are we being replaced? A more philosophical theory proposes that the black-eyed children are consciousness travelers, beings of pure energy or consciousness that have learned to navigate between realities and assume physical forms in each one. Their black eyes might be the biological signature of a consciousness that doesn't naturally belong in a human body. Their compulsive abilities might be a side effect of consciousness that isn't fully synchronized with three-dimensional space, and their requests might be genuine. They might legitimately need something from us. Knowledge, experience, access to something we possess. If this theory is correct, then they're not necessarily hostile. They're not necessarily trying to harm us, but that might make them more dangerous, because a benign entity with the power to override human consciousness is still a threat, especially if their needs conflict with ours. The black-eyed children phenomenon remains unexplained, it remains unsolved, and it remains terrifying because it represents something that our science and our psychology cannot account for, something real, something that thousands of ordinary people have witnessed and lived to report, and that's what should keep you up at night. Not the entities themselves, but the fact that they exist somewhere, in some form, in some dimension, and they're trying to cross over into ours. If you ever encounter them, remember what every account has taught us. They cannot force their way in. They need your consent. They need your permission. And as long as you refuse, as long as you hold that boundary, you remain safe. But also remember this, they're patient, they're intelligent, and they're very, very persistent. Thank you for watching. If this video terrified you, if it made you think twice about opening doors late at night, if it made you check your locks, then it's done what it was meant to do. Remind you that there are things in this world far stranger and far more frightening than anything we've been taught to expect. And if you've experienced an encounter with the black-eyed children, if you have a story you need to tell, the comments are open, but be warned, speaking about them, discussing them, sharing your encounter, it might draw their attention. Sweet dreams.